Started here. It says live. We are not truly live quite yet. And anybody who wants to be on mute now would be the time, as we are going to go live in about 30 seconds. Thank you to everyone who is joining us live on Facebook and YouTube. We will be getting started in about 60 seconds. Thank you once again to everyone who is joining us for tonight's Dead End Drug Arrests Unwritten Rules discussion. Here is Olivia Obinama.
There we go. Good evening, everyone. My name is Olivia Obinama. I am the manager of partnerships and local content at the Better Government Association. On behalf of the BGA and the Chicago Sun-Times, I want to welcome you to our program this evening. Tonight, we're discussing Unwritten Rules, Understanding Cook County's Pattern of Dead-End Drug Arrests, where you'll hear from Better Government Association investigative reporter Casey Toner in conversation with panelist Era Loudermilk, Chief of Staff at the Cook County Public Defender's Office, Ben Riddell, Director of Criminal Justice Policy with the ACLU of Illinois, Professor Benny Lee, founder and CEO of the National Alliance for the Empowerment of the Incarcerated, and Kathy Kane Willis, Chicago Urban League's Director of Research and Policy. This event and our latest investigation, Dead End Drug Arrests, are part of our work for the circuit, a joint project from the Better Government Association and Injustice Watch in partnership with the civic tech consulting firm DataMade. You can learn more about that project at thecircuit.cc. The University of Southern California's Annenberg Center for Health Journalism also provided financial support for the Dead End Drug Arrest Project through a 2021 National Fellowship. You can find links to the circuit and our latest investigation, Dead End Drug Arrests, in the Facebook Live chat box, as well as the Chicago Sun-Times YouTube chat box. Following their discussion, we'll open the conversation for questions and then provide you with two important surveys before closing out with final thoughts from our panelists. Please feel free to place your questions in the Facebook event live or Chicago Sun-Times YouTube chat boxes. A video recording of this event will be available later this week. It will be uploaded on the BGA YouTube page and shared on both Sun-Times and BGA social platforms. Now let's introduce Casey and the panelists. Casey Toner is an investigative reporter at the Better Government Association. Before joining the BGA, the longtime local journalist worked as a government and political reporter for AL.com, a statewide online reporting site operated by a consortium of Alabama newspapers. He also worked for more than 4 years at the Southtown Star on major beats and investigative stories. Era Loudermilk is the chief of staff at the Cook County Public Defender's Office, whose mission is to protect the fundamental rights, liberties, and dignity of each person whose case has been entrusted to the office by providing legal representation. Loudermilk has served in numerous leadership roles in criminal justice and juvenile justice at the state and local levels, implementing policies aimed to enhance positive outcomes for justice-involved people. Loudermilk holds a Bachelor of Arts in the Political Science in Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and a Juris Doctor from the University of Illinois College of Law in Champaign, Illinois. Ben Rudell is the Director of Criminal Justice Policy with the ACLU of Illinois. He is responsible for drafting and analyzing criminal justice legislation and lobbying in the Illinois General Assembly. Rudell also joined ACLU of Illinois in April 2015 after more than 7 years in the office of the Illinois House Minority Leader, during which time he held the position of Deputy Legal Counsel and staffed the Judiciary and Criminal Law Committees. Prior to his work in legislature, Rudell practiced law in Chicago. Professor Benny Lee is the founder and CEO of the National Alliance for the Empowerment of the Formerly Incarcerated, a community-based organization committed to advocating and providing positive alternatives for the formerly incarcerated person. He also acts as a community liaison and reentry specialist for treatment alternatives for safe communities. And with his associate's degree in mental health and substance abuse at Kennedy King College, Professor Lee received both his bachelor's and master's degree at Northeastern Illinois University, where he's now an adjunct professor in the Justice Studies Department. And last but not least, Kathy Kane-Willis is the Director of Research at the Chicago Urban League with over 20 years of experience in policy research. Kane-Willis focuses on a broader range of social justice issues at the intersection of race, including criminal justice reform, health, economic justice, and democracy. Before joining the League, she co-founded and directed the Illinois Consortium on Drug Policy, a public policy research institute at Roosevelt University, to foster a public health approach to drug use and drug policy. And during that time, accomplishments included advancing and implementing harm reduction policy solutions to the heroin and opioid crisis, including Good Samaritan immunity laws and naloxone access laws in the Midwest. Now I will turn it to your moderator for the night, Casey.
Yes, thanks, Olivia. Good evening, everyone. This project started several years ago in a courtroom, weekend bond court at 26th Street in California. I was covering it for the Chicago Sun-Times. I noticed when I was there that the court call was packed with cases involving people who use drugs, drug possession cases. And after further research into the data, we discovered that drug possession is the most frequent felony charge in Cook County. We wondered, how could this be? And, what's happening in these cases and the people behind them. When we dove into it, we found that, most of the cases are for trace amounts of drugs, and they're being dismissed almost as soon as they enter the court system. In fact, everyone we spoke to, judges, cops, prosecutors, drug users, activists, they knew about it. It was described as an unwritten rule of the Cook County courts. We'll discuss some of the major issues at play here, but before we do that, we're going to show you a brief video that highlights some of what we investigated.
In Chicago, thousands of people get arrested every year for carrying small amounts of drugs. Less than a gram, the weight of a paperclip. But there's an unwritten rule in the courthouse. Almost every one of those cases gets thrown out, usually within a few weeks. These dead-end drug arrests cost taxpayers millions of dollars. And the people who get arrested lose their jobs, housing, freedom. This is Alex. He's 25. He grew up in the south suburbs. He's been arrested a few times for carrying small amounts of heroin. It always ends the same way. He gets locked up and his case gets dismissed.
What is the point of arresting the user and wasting taxpayer dollars to bring that user to court, to not really offer them much of an alternative other than we're going to go ahead and let this case go and kick you out of here, we're going to dismiss all charges, we don't want to see you again. But that cycle repeats itself because I've gone through that 2 or 3 times and the result has literally been cookie cutter the same.
Luther Sias sees this play out all the time. He supervises outreach workers for the West Side Heroin and Opioid Task Force. They hand out overdose reversal drugs and train people to use them. And they help people get into drug treatment.
First of all, we're out here to save a life. Secondly, we reverse the overdose if there is an overdose. Thirdly, we try and get them into treatment or get them on medication where they can kind of wean themselves off of whatever it is they're using.
Outside an abandoned public bathroom in Garfield Park, lots of people buy heroin and shoot up. People leave their syringes on the ground here. Sias says they need help. He doesn't understand why police arrest so many people for carrying small amounts of heroin.
I think if it's small amounts, it's harmful to them, the community, and the taxpayers.
Sias says the city should double down on a Chicago police program that lets people get treatment and avoid jail.
I would love to see it expand and be especially in the targeted area that we work.
Other states have lowered the penalties for narcotics. In Oregon, you only get a ticket for a dime bag. In Illinois, marijuana has been decriminalized. But the charges for even the smallest amounts of drugs like heroin and cocaine are felonies. In Chicago, most of those arrests are on the west side, and they're concentrated in the neighborhoods surrounding Garfield Park, 5 miles west of downtown. There's the Eisenhower Expressway. Some people call it the Heroin Highway. For decades, it's brought buyers here. They keep coming despite the risks. This seemingly crazy cycle, police arresting people for small amounts of drugs and the courts letting them go, never ends.
Well, I guess we're going to kind of open up to our panelists now. Our project, we kind of looked at, 20 years of drug arrest and the trends within those 20 years. And so, I'm going to open it up here. And, my first question is, what are some of the things that you've seen over the past 20 years when it comes to, drug arrests, patterns, trends, that sort of thing?
I conducted a study in, I believe it was 2011, 2012, where we followed cases at preliminary hearing to look at what cases were thrown out and what cases were bound over. And we saw the same pattern that you saw in your research. You obviously, dug in and had better data sources than we did at that time. But one of the things that we found is when cases are bound over, it's not necessarily because of anything different happening in the amount or whatever. It could be like somebody said, yay, I'm out of this place, and the judge called them back and said, okay, we're binding you over because you were disruptive. So you can see the pattern. You can see that there's an agreement because it follows a specific pattern in terms of the preliminary hearing, sort of like the prosecution and the defense know what's going to happen, that the case will be dismissed or not bound over. But by the time that happens, though, preliminary hearing, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm a researcher, is not like the very first thing that happens to you. I believe there's a bond hearing, and I'm sure that the lawyers on the panel can talk about this in more detail. By the time you get to preliminary hearing, you're probably in jail for a bit of time, and that means that your tolerance, if you are addicted to opioids, is going to decrease. And so unfortunately, what we do see is a huge increase in overdose deaths. The overdose deaths increase 40 to 120 times after a period of any kind of detention or incarceration. So the increasing opioid deaths in Illinois and in Chicago could be directly a result of these kinds of practices.
All right. That's interesting, and kind of falls in line with our reporting too. And one thing that we kind of emphasize in our story are the drug markets that exist on the west side, and this is an area with a high concentration of Black residents. And I was wondering if we can kind of break down how we got there. We know that this is not an isolated phenomenon. And although people have choices with what they do, it's not as if the Black community decided that their neighborhood was to be used for drug dealing. How did the West Side become a high traffic area for these transactions? Who are involved in this issue of drug markets on the West Side?
I can jump in and try and start to answer that question, and then let others jump in. I think some of that is detailed in your story, where segregation and economic disinvestment are really, I think, the short answers to that question. What produced the social conditions and just the real lack of economic opportunity that is that's faced by residents of low-income neighborhoods on the West Side. And there's those geographic areas are not only the locus of a disproportionate number of drug arrests, they're also the place where we have the most fatal overdoses, and also track with just about every other condition of social deprivation or oppression that you could name, because the underlying causes of poverty, segregation, and disinvestment.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Ben is saying, but I would also add on to like that myriad of factors is the police practices, right? We live in a city that has a documented history of very targeted police practices in predominantly Black communities, and specifically on the West Side, in terms of how they are selectively enforcing certain laws, and in this case, drug laws, right? We know that Black people and white people use drugs at very similar rates. Yet, when you look at the practice and pattern of how the city is policed, overwhelming majority of their resources when it comes to drug enforcement is focused on the West Side. And I think, really there's an argument to be made that these are discriminatory practices that are being made solely because of the race of the people that live in that community. And it's a very targeted effort to incarcerate people. And there's just a cycle, because the same people are getting arrested. They're being hauled into the jail. Kathy talked about the consequences, which, if we need to be frank, it's a matter of life or death for a lot of these people. When you take someone, put them in an incarcerated setting, and then you release them, the likelihood that that person is going to overdose and die drastically increases. So I think one of the big issues and challenges that we have is this idea that this is a criminal situation rather than a public health crisis.
And to kind of hit on this general idea, in our story, we focus in on a couple of these police beats, out on the West Side where the markets are, And some of these areas have just extremely high violent crime, right? Like really, really serious issues. And we noticed that, despite these really, really serious criminal issues, up to a quarter of, all their arrests are for drug arrests, cases that, get, just kind of quickly dismissed. Since Benny's on, I was wondering, if he has anything to add here, or just want me to kind of go through it.
Well, from where I sit, being once a heroin addict myself and being a gang leader on the West Side and still having relationships with these young gang members today and these young people that's out there in the streets with the work I do, it's too much harassment going on. You don't have policing going on in the community. You have militarism. The communities are under siege. I mean, it's trauma to be between, I would say, 12 years old and up, and you and your buddy just walking down the street. At any given minute, you could get thrown up against the car, shook down. If you get pulled over, it's not really for traffic. It's because you in a car just driving through. So the community is under siege, and that's caused a lot of frustration, right? And then when you look at who's trying to invest in, as Martin Luther King put it, the three evils that causes a lot of this crime and violence in our society is racism, militarism, and poverty. Mm. And who's really trying to address those to remove the poverty in these communities? When you look at that $1 million block study, they started in New York, identifying one block where they gross over $1 million annually off of that one block from arrests. They did it here in Chicago, starting in Austin on Cicero and Adams. And they looked at 1.7 million annually from that one block. And they done identified 80 blocks in Chicago that are considered $1 million blocks. So these people are targets. They getting arrested regularly. They getting locked up in jail, no bond, the whole shebang, stiffer sentences, right? And when you look at the Illinois prison, 60% of those people in the Illinois prison come from those 6 neighborhoods in Chicago. 6 neighborhoods in Chicago make up over 60% of Illinois prison population. You got more people, when you really look at it, you got more people in these communities on house arrest than you have in the whole Illinois prison system. This morning, more people woke up on house arrest this morning in those 6 neighborhoods than you have in the whole Illinois prison system. So these people are being targeted, those communities are being targeted, right? And so this is why you have this high rate. Like someone mentioned, you go in these death plains and those communities like that, you got drug selling and drug use going on rapidly out there, but they're not being arrested, stopped frequently as they are in the inner city. So you got militarism that's got these communities under siege. And, guys like me, these guys called OG, when I try to get them to look at how they being victimized and their commodities and stuff, it's like, well, we respect what you're saying, but you can't protect us. Because I haven't even been out there talking with them, and I've been thrown up against the wall right along with them. Mm-hmm. Police don't even have no regards or no respect when I show them my ID that I'm, one of the trainers for nonviolence at Institute for Nonviolence Chicago, or when I was with Ceasefire or with my own organization, I get thrown up against the car right along with them. So it's like they unprotected. They don't have no trust in nobody. They unprotected. And when you look at all the trauma they got to go through, not to mention adverse childhood experiences, from 5, 6, 7 years old, seeing fathers getting locked up, hearing people getting shot, all that's trauma, and they grow up with that stuff, right? So yeah, until those conditions and those 3 evils are addressed, you're gonna have this problem.
Can I piggyback on one thing, something that everybody sort of said? One of the things that I wanted to say is that, when we did the study of preliminary hearing and cases that were bound over, and I will say a pattern of what police say happens is that people throw the drugs at the police's feet. But what is happening is illegal searches and seizures. And so, like, my joke was, and it's not a funny joke, but like, dress up as a cop and people will throw drugs at you, because that's literally how they talk about it. Well, the person, threw the drugs at my feet. I think that when we're talking about this, and this goes to Benny's point, is like, it really is like being under siege, because I've had people come, I live very close to this area, and I've taken people around and they have been shocked at how community members are treated, slammed over police cars, slammed up against walls, all of that sort of thing.
And to provide a different perspective, and this is one that I've heard. People who live in the community are also worried about violence, right? And some of the people who are operating the markets, they're part of criminal organizations that are capable of committing real violence, right? And according to the police, they say that they often grab drug users to try to get at the gang members and kind of go up the ladder. And another thing that I heard this morning, we were out on the west side this morning for an event, and a woman who lives out there was talking about how an issue she has is that she just doesn't want this outside of her house, right? She doesn't want people selling drugs outside of her house, and she tells them just go to the vacant lot, 3 houses down, but if you are in front of my house, I'm going to call the police, right? And so that's a concern that that people have. And I was just wondering, what are your thoughts about this? About these kind of different perspectives, about this problem.
Well, one thing I know for sure is that the drug dealers are not the shooters and the killers. You got some guys sell drugs for a living. You got some guys that rob people for a living, and some guys breaking houses for a living, and some steal cars for a living. Those are inner city professions. When I grew up, I didn't want to become no lawyer. I wanted to be a short con artist. I had some buddies, they didn't want to be short con artists, they wanted to be pimps. These become the profession you want to get in, to survive in the ghetto. So a lot of this violence is really not coming from the drug dealers. This is coming from guys that's what they do. They shoot people, they kill people. Because a lot of these killings are not drug related, but then they try to label it gang related. It's not really gang related. If I got say a baby by error, all right, me and her got a child together, we break up, right? Then she started dating you, Casey, right? But then when I come visit her, then you smoking weed around my son. Now I got an issue with you smoking weed around my son. So that leaded to me and her in a conflict, and then you hear about it, and that lead a conflict between me and you, then one of us shoot each other. They would say it's gang related when really that's a personal issue. Right? Sure. A lot of that going on. So gangs get scapegoated for the violence and the crime that's in the community. When you just got regular people, just coming up in that unemployed, uneducated, no ability to get a job because they lack education or skills or whatever, and they get caught up in that, and violence comes with it.
And that said, though, I just wanted to kind of get at this point again. What about people who just don't want drug dealing in front of their houses? Right?
I think it's like a catch-22, especially if you're a Black person living in a neighborhood, right? Because on the one hand, yeah, it would be nice if I could trust that if I call a police officer because I need help with something, that it won't result in it going terribly wrong and somebody dying or worse. Or on the other hand, if I call the police, I would hope that they would actually show up and help me instead of turn and look at me as if I did something wrong. So I think we have to acknowledge that there's a serious disconnect between law enforcement and the communities of people that they are charged with serving and protecting. There's a huge disconnect there. And to Benny's point, when you live in a neighborhood where there's no grocery store, no opportunity for meaningful employment, you don't have access to decent education, you're gonna do what you need to do to survive. And people need to survive. Like that woman you talked to, I think she recognizes This is how you are feeding your family. This is how you're making a living. I don't necessarily want it in front of my house, but I'm not going to call the police on you because I don't want you to die or go to jail for trying to put food on your family's table. So, you know, if we had more investment in the neighborhoods, if it actually had better opportunities for people, then there would be a more attractive, meaningful opportunity for people to find other ways to support themselves and their families outside of drugs. But to answer the violence question, I mean, CPD is not really, I mean, they're really good at arresting people for possession of drugs. They're really good at arresting people for having a weapon in their car because they're carrying that for protection. They're not that good at arresting people who are actually shooting.
You know, I live in Humboldt Park, and when my daughter was 2, I had somebody set up shop right across the street from my house selling drugs. And I did make that call because I was like, you know what? You weren't here when I bought my house. Why are you selling drugs? I called. This is in the 90s, so, you know, don't hate on me. But like, do you know what the police response was? We can't do anything about that. We need to know where the drugs are. Do you know where the drugs are? When I call about shots fired, do they come? No, they don't. They say, do you see the shooter? I'm like, no, I'm calling because I heard shots fired. And they're like, we can't do anything unless you saw something. And so I have to say that after the 10th time you called, you don't call no more because you don't. Because what, and when you see a murder in front of your house and the police are making jokes about it, you know what? You don't ever call again.
So on, a slightly different, subject, we're trying to look at solutions, right? Because I think a lot of people are just frustrated. I talked to my mom and she about the story and she read it and she said that, it was just kind of disheartening, because she didn't know what to do, right? Or even what to think about what to do. But we went to Oregon earlier this summer where they have recently decriminalized small amounts of drugs such as cocaine or heroin for, personal possession. So you get a ticket rather than a criminal charge. When we talked to a prosecutor out there, the prosecutors were by and large, against the decriminalization bill. He shared with us his perspective that drug courts work and drug arrests are an important way to help to get people into treatment. What's your response?
I can take the first crack at this. I think, drug courts have really been oversold as far as, judges and lawyers being equipped to manage a complex health condition like addiction. And they're also extremely resource intensive and very intensive, hands-on, disruptive of somebody's life. Not to say that there's no place for a drug court, but in my opinion, the place for a drug court is when somebody is facing a very serious charge, not a small-time drug possession charge, but something much more serious that carries a much more serious prison sentence. And there's evidence that it's tied in the alleged crime with a substance use disorder. An intervention like that might be appropriate as a last-ditch attempt to keep somebody from going to prison for a long time for a serious crime. It's not an appropriate intervention for somebody who was caught with half a gram of something in their pocket. That's just not only is it a bad use of resources, an inefficient use of resources, but it can be harmful. It can really be harmful when we're incarcerating people and we are, requiring them to take drug tests and be stay at home all the time, preventing them from working, and it's not the track record of success is not great. The track record of success for voluntary treatment offered in communities is much better. And so I think that we need to stop. We need to push back on the idea of the drug courts as a panacea. I think the court system, the criminal legal system, has just been overused and has been misused as the primary way that we deal with with people who use drugs, as opposed to our health systems and our treatment, harm reduction, street outreach. These are the things that we should be investing in. We shouldn't be doubling down on drug courts.
So, who do you think needs to take, more responsibility? Because, there are some people, right, who, will not enter treatment voluntarily, right? And I guess that's like a, kind of like a philosophical question, what do you do in those cases where people are just intent on, just doing major amounts of drugs? I mean, I guess, they'll say that the drug courts
What do we do with
are here
people
for
who
this.
eat major amounts of bacon and get cardiovascular disease and drop dead of heart attacks? I don't think there's too much other difference, except that these things are illegal. And that's, not the same. So like, what do we do with people who drink too much? What do we do with people absent getting into a car and driving? Like, I don't think that there's anything that can be done. The problem with drug courts is the judge doesn't know about addictive illness. The best evidence-based ways to treat people. There, a lot of times this is really old, not using good science to treat people. And like the judge being the ruler over this when it's not a clinician is absolutely wrong. Would you want your health if you had heart disease, would you want a judge overseeing your heart treatment? Because I sure wouldn't.
Right. I think part of the issue is medical professionals will tell all of us that relapse is a part of recovery. And we know that when the idea that you have to, we need to acknowledge that everyone that gets diverted to a drug treatment court doesn't have an addiction, right? But yet we have put people in a situation to admit to having having a problem that they don't have, just to avoid incarceration. And then we put them on that alternative court track. And yes, the drug court is good at having a more collaborative approach to addressing the client's needs. But the problem is relapse is a part of recovery, and having the idea that if someone relapses and has a medical slip because of this addiction, the fact that we are sending them to a jail or prison rather than to a hospital to get treatment to help them get better, it doesn't make any sense. It's just not the best use of resources. The court system is not the appropriate place to have people recover from these addictions. It's just not.
And so, what
In
were you going to say, Benny?
Yeah, in my case, I was a heroin addict, but I was a criminal first before I was an addict. And that's where Taz had to tease out. Is my case a direct result of my addiction, or is it because of my criminal, being a criminal, right? But what they were able to see, and thank God for Judge Moran, who mandated me to treatment, because I was locked up. What they saw was that I had too many repeated arrests frequently as a result of my addiction. I was a criminal and was catching cases before I ever got high. So they could have easily ruled out that I don't need treatment because I'm a criminal. And this mandate to task is for an addict. But they clearly saw that I became an addict. And now these cases was cases where before I became an addict, I was armed robbery and heavy crime. But once I became addicted to heroin, then it became petty frequent crimes, showing that I had an addiction. And what happens when a person is assessed, right? The assessor has to say, yeah, this is an addict versus this is, because I'd go to Sheridan, where it used to be the whole prison was treatment, but now they got general population. And you got a lot of guys come through Sheridan, through SWIC, all these prisons where there's treatment that are not addicts. These are drug dealers, but now someone say he need to go to treatment because he sold drugs, but he's not an addict. And that's what we got to weed out. Do we send drug dealers to treatment, or do we send a drug addict to treatment? And that's where the drug court get the bad rap, because they treating a lot of drug dealers in a drug court when they should be treating the drug addict in drug court, not the drug dealer.
Just one quick point to piggyback off something Era said. There's a lot of research out there that shows that if you take somebody who's not in need of treatment and you put them in treatment, you can create problems that didn't exist for that person. Or if you take somebody who needs treatment and you put them in the wrong kind of treatment that isn't suited to them, then you can make matters worse. You can actually do harm. And that is a risk that is especially great when the person deciding who's got to get treatment and what kind of treatment they have to have is not a clinician, but is trained in the legal profession instead. We are using the completely wrong system to deal with a health issue. We should never be, we should never be putting police, judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys in that position. So to your question about who's responsible, ultimately, I would lay the most responsibility at the feet of policymakers, lawmakers, the folks who have chronically underfunded the health system and not provided people who use drugs with the support to get appropriate treatment in their communities and to save lives, by, instead of offering harm reduction to stigmatize people and push them away from the services that could help them, constantly doubling down on funding the police and the courts and, seizing upon solutions like drug courts that are really, not the ultimate answer here. So like, when we look at what solutions are long-term, all signs point to fewer people in the legal system, more people getting services in the health system. And, there are different paths to get to that, but we just need to stop criminalizing addiction. And, I'm very grateful to the Sun-Times and BGA for shedding light on this this issue that, as your reporting reveals, isn't new. It's been going on since the 1970s of just high volume of drug arrests to no end, but doing great harm and costing us all a lot of money.
Well, I think we have maybe about one or two more questions. And one I wanted to ask about, just kind of the central points of our story, and that's that, we see that up to 70% of these drug possession arrests, felony cases are kicked out of court, at the earlier stages. And for cases where someone's carrying a gram or less, that number is, up to 95%. Judges, prosecutors, police told us that, it's been this way for a long time. And, I guess my question, it's for anyone, but, I figured the defender's office might be kind of well equipped to handle it. Is this something that you've been aware of, and do you have any kind of specific policy to deal with it?
I mean, our office, we, at the heart of what we do, it really is to protect the rights of people and ensure that they are entitled to due process, right? So, there's a disconnect in our criminal court system in the fact that, our police department has the authority to directly bring these cases to court, right? So typically, before like a felony case can come into the criminal court system, the state's attorney's office will do a felony review and they will determine whether or not there are enough elements of the alleged crime to be charged sufficient enough to actually be filed in court. I think what we see is like the floodgates are basically open because, you know, the CPD has discretion to just determine those charges on their own, and then they come directly to court. And this is particularly problematic in a city such as Chicago with a documented history of police misconduct and abuses, particularly as relates to their interactions with Black men. Our public defenders see that on a daily basis. They, you know, do whatever they can to try and get these folks back home as soon as possible. But we know that even just 1 day, 2 days incarcerated in a jail, waiting for a bail decision, waiting for, you know, the ability to go home, like that can be detrimental to our clients. So we've seen this day in, day out, every day for years, and it's our job to do the best that we can to put our clients in the best position to go home and hopefully get these charges dropped so they can move on. But they shouldn't have to go through this kind of disruption in their lives for it to just be dismissed because everyone knows that's what's going to happen anyway. Like, why are we even making people come into the system? Like, we have this thing in our country where we incarcerate people because we're just mad at them, and then we let the chips fall where they may in due time. We have to stop doing that. We can't afford it. It's really jeopardizing people's abilities to maintain any kind of sense of stability. I mean, most of these people are literally 1 day away from calling in sick from work or not showing up to work for everything to fall apart. That's rent, that your car may be towed. That, I mean, there's so many collateral consequences, both financially, but then if you actually do have a real addiction, and our attorneys see this, you do have a real addiction, you're incarcerated, the treatment that you get in an incarcerated setting is never going to be good. You can't lock somebody in a cage for 23 hours out of a day and withhold them from drugs and think that that's really going to be effective treatment, because as soon as they go home, that addiction is going to kick in. They're more likely to overdose, and it can be very tragic. And
it's so, you know, kind of like real quick, like, you know, lightning round, you know, like in one sentence, like, you know, what's a real fast way to like maybe improve the state of things?
Decriminalize simple drug possession. I mean, decriminalize it, not defelonize it, but decriminalize it.
Yeah, I think we need to stop incarcerating people. We need to stop giving people criminal records. And we need to stop thinking that a legal system is equipped to make medical decisions. I think those are just like my lightning round answers.
Because when you look at the relapse rate among those that get caught up in the criminal justice system, just being in that system alone is trauma. You know, relapse, you know, people relapse to change how they feel or can't cope, you know, like the sister, how you spell it?
Era. Mm-hmm.
I'm saying it right. I mean, just think about it. When I was in Gateway, I'd been through the drug program in the jail. Then Taz took me out of jail, put me in Gateway, right? And then when it come time for me to go job searching, that was trauma for them to ask me to put a resume together when I never had a job, didn't know what a resume was. Now all my inadequacies and inferiorities, that's enough for me to get high to change how I feel. Then to throw me out there with a white shirt on and a black tie with a resume up under my arm, feeling like I can nickel somebody because I'm dressed like the guy I used to victimize. All that is trauma. But if I don't have a safe place where I can go and get normalized, I'm gonna get high. Because I've been trained, and my body is trained, my stimulants trained me to get high to cope, right? And if no one pay any attention to these psychological barriers, these psychological blockades, you know, the messages I'm giving myself, that man, this ain't gonna work. But who gonna hire me because of my back? Who gonna hire me because of this conviction? All that set me up to seek some relief. And as an addict, what do I do for relief? I get high. And if people are not paying attention to that, versus, well, if you don't do this, we can violate you. If you don't do this, we're gonna revoke your mandate. And that's what the focus was on, not the person, not the psychology I was dealing with, you know, 32 trying to sit in a GED class, learning fractions and multiplication, and little kids laughing at the questions I'm asking, calling me, going to hit one of them in the eye, right? All that stuff leads to potential relapse. But just through the grace of God, I had a support network of brothers that was in the penitentiary with me, but had been home before me, that was stable and normalized what I was going through and say, hey, we went through that too, and this is how we dealt with it. So they pulled me through, not the courts, not the parole officer, not the case manager, my peers. That support network pulled me through the grace of God. It's been 37 years since I even had a cigarette.
Yeah. Well, I think I'll just say really quickly, you know, at the end of the day, I think we all need to just realize that it's not appropriate for police to be the first response when people are in crisis. I think the criminal justice system is not equipped to deal with what we all have identified as a health issue. And I think that the health system needs to be adequately invested in throughout the communities that are dealing with this the most, to ensure that they have immediate access to the health care that they need.
Well, I think that's kind of a good note to, wrap this up on. It looks like we have some time for some audience questions, so I'm going to hand this over to Olivia.
Thanks, Casey, and thank you, panelists. We have a few questions. I'll start with seeming a frustrating one from Robert Tracy. Says,
Olivia, we're having a really hard time hearing you, or at least I am.
Can you hear me now?
That's better, thank you.
Okay, I'll raise my voice. So we have a question from Robert Tracy. He says, question, it seems to me most people arrested for drug use are on the street causing problems. So how many employed people are arrested doing drugs on the street?
Well, there's not a lot of police officers who are like coming to our jobs, checking our purses to see if we have, I mean, the issue with a lot of people who are suffering from addiction or self-medicating because they have underlying mental health issues that they don't have access to the healthcare to deal with. So I think that is really at the heart of why you may see that. And, again, when you see someone that is in crisis, the appropriate thing is to get them to treatment.
And I have a question. Does it matter whether they have employment? I mean, I get that we would like them to have employment, but is the arrest going to get them employed? Is the arrest, the intervention, going to help them live a more stable life? Is it going to give them housing? Is it going to give them a job? I don't think so. I mean, these are the things that we do not get from arresting people. These are the things that arresting people breaks those connections. So you can be assured that if somebody does have a job and they have to go to jail, that they're probably going to lose that job.
We have a comment from Darva Watkins. This was a comment that was submitted during registration. Every prisoner who was arrested for selling the same drug that has been made legal should pay restitution to all felons. What are your thoughts on Darva's comment there?
I disagree with it. I just, I mean, there is harm that is associated with drugs. There's no doubt about it. We're suffering, record overdose deaths in this state and every other state. But what has been a really unproductive response to that is to try and treat people who are, either selling drugs or sometimes even using drugs with somebody else where a tragic fatal overdose happens as like having committed a homicide. And, in fact, there is a law in the books, drug-induced homicide, where you see girlfriends charged for homicide for their boyfriend dying. And, that's the wrong frame when you look at drug use or drug sales for that matter. And, despite the myth that, drug people who use drugs and people who sell drugs are two distinct groups of people, there's a high degree of overlap there. You know, there's a lot of research showing that people who are caught up in drug dealing are often using drugs too. And so, you know, this whole cycle is not something that is going to be solved or, you know, improved productively by using the tools of the criminal justice system, whether that be, you know, restitution or probation or jail or prison. It's just, you know, we have to look at this as a health issue.
I saw someone else wanted to jump in. No? Okay. Another question from Shannon Slayer. Prisons are now corporations trying to please investors. Some civil liberty organizations think this keeps incarceration level high. In Oklahoma, where I live, there are district judges invested in prison industries. Has this level of corruption been identified in Illinois?
At least for me, from my circle, I would think that's common knowledge to everybody about the prison industrial complex. People are profiting off of incarceration, right? I mean, just look here in Illinois, you know, the smocks that the doctors wear at Stroger's Hospital is produced by women inmates, right? People are actually profiting off of prison. You ever known anybody go to work to make license plates or road signs? No, they made in prison in a sheet and metal shop. You know, that's big business. People, careers, people would suffer, people would struggle. If incarceration went down, a lot of people would lose careers, wouldn't be able to pay for their homes when they put their children. So crime is paying some people. People need people locked up. It's big business.
A quick comment about privatization. In Illinois, one good thing in our law is that we have a prohibition on actual private prisons. So we don't have like those big corporations being the actual operators of the prisons. But that's not to say that we don't have big profit motive. We have vendors inside the prisons that provide, you know, commissary, medical, phones, you know, phone service, and then in community corrections, in probation, the people who provide drug testing, electronic monitoring, all of these so-called services are, you know, in it for a buck. So, everything that Professor Lee said is absolutely right. It manifests itself in a slightly different form than, in places where they have actual private prisons.
Yeah. And our last question, due to time, from Peter Winslow. Would supervised safe injection sites be a viable solution in Chicago, parentheses, even though a significant amount of arrests are only for possessions, not actual drug use? Who are proponents and who are the challengers?
I mean, I think supervised consumption sites or overdose prevention sites are an answer to a different question, which is not arrest. Like, I don't think that like they wouldn't have the kind of capacity to be able to accommodate the number of people who are arrested on a yearly basis or a daily basis in Chicago. So I do think that, supervised safe consumption sites or overdose prevention sites are useful, but bringing them to scale for everybody to use in Chicago would not be, I don't think, it's a very niche thing. I think that there's utility in it because nobody's ever died in a overdose prevention site or a safe consumption site. But I don't think that's dealing with the question that we're dealing with now, which is how do we stop this pattern of arrests that are literally killing people? I don't know that being in a safe consumption site would stop people from getting arrested. In the safe consumption site, they might not get arrested, but on the way to, the way from, like all of those other parts, I think would be very tremendously complicated. And I think that I don't know that the population that gets arrested and the population that's disproportionately dying would trust and use, meaning Black men, would use safe consumption sites because of the history of over-policing and militarization and torture. in Chicago, and literally torture.
I don't believe in those type of sites, because I'm looking at, if you allow me access to shoot heroin, it's gonna keep me in a state, in a certain condition. Then you ain't got to worry about me trying to get an education or a skill or a trade and moving on with my life and eventually getting off of that. You're gonna keep me stuck. That's a form of slavery to me. So I don't believe in that. I believe brothers and sisters should be challenged to get off the drugs, to look at themselves, to look at their lives and move on, instead of just get stuck in someone enabling them to do that. That's why I don't buy into those type of sites.
Yeah, and we're hitting 7:30, but I want to get just the last final thoughts from panelist Casey. I'll let you take this. Any final thoughts? What should people take away from this project, from the issues that we've discussed tonight? Casey?
Maybe Eric can begin and just, kind of wrap it up and, be quick and.
Yeah, so I would hope, it's always heartbreaking when history repeats itself. And I think what we're seeing here now is like a repeat of what happened like during the Prohibition era, right? Like they outlawed alcohol. It became very dangerous because all of a sudden it created these underground markets and it created these tainted alcohol batches and people were dying from it. And the government at one point realized like, oh my God, we've made things worse. We are gonna legalize it, have some regulations in place, monitor it, and provide treatment options. I think this is very similar. It's just in the form of a different type of a drug. And I hope that we can take a lesson from the history books and really move forward and have a much more best evidence practice approach to how we deal with these health issues. The criminal court system isn't it. And in fact, I think it's actually making the matters worse.
Anyone else have any final thoughts before we close?
I'll just share that the ACLU, along with some of the other panelists and other groups, have been working for several years now to pass legislation to start to move Illinois away from the overcriminalization of drug use. You mentioned, Casey, in your introduction that in Illinois, possession of any amount of any drug is a felony in Illinois. That is not the case in 20 other states. We have many other states that treat drug possession as a misdemeanor. One state that treats it not as a crime at all, but as a ticketable infraction. But the advantages of misdemeanor penalties, it's not a perfect solution. It's a partial incremental solution, but we're slamming shut the prison doors. Nobody should ever be sent to IDOC because they use drugs. That's not a reason to send somebody to prison. Shouldn't be a reason. And so getting rid of the felony penalty takes that away. The felony record that people live with for their entire lives is, a lot of people go on probation. They don't go to prison, but they live their lives with that felony record. And that means big obstacles to housing, education, and employment, all the things that provide stability and make it more likely that somebody's going to get away from chaotic drug use. So those things are so disruptive. And then just the adverse health consequences of putting people in incarceration is literally killing people. So that harm that the current system is doing could be lessened greatly by passing House Bill 3447 to make it a misdemeanor instead of a felony.
Gotcha. So we're 4 minutes over time. I don't want us to use up more of your time, panelists, but thank you again, Eric Loudermilk, Ben Rudell, Kathy Kane-Willis, and of course, Professor Benny Lee for joining us. Special thanks to Casey for moderating this conversation. Before we say goodnight, you can still, our viewers at home, streaming wherever, you can still help inform the Better Government Association and Chicago Sun-Times reporting on how the Cook County court system handles drug charges by taking our Illinois Drugs Law Survey. You can find the link in the chat boxes on Facebook Live and YouTube. And if you're interested in more events like this, or you have ways that we can improve our events, please also take our event feedback survey, and you can share your interests with us there and how we can improve our programming. And of course, we'll truly appreciate that. And finally, well, before that, you can also, as you know, this is part of the Circuit Project, where we are exploring the Cook County court system. We have a Facebook group, so it's called The Circuit. And if you want to learn more about the Cook County court system, if you want to learn more about our ongoing project, The Circuit, where we are examining 3 million criminal cases obtained from the Cook County Circuit Court, please make sure to accept the group rules, but find us at facebook.com/groups/thecircuit.cc. And of course, you can search us there just by The Circuit. And also know that this is a very intensive type of reporting that Casey, his colleagues, Jared Rutecki, Frank Main, they put this a lot of work into, and it takes time and it takes investment to really dig in to the different types of issues that we were able to talk today with these experts. So if you can find a way to support us, support our respective newsrooms by donating and subscribing to us, you can help us continue this public service. You can find those links on how to subscribe to our newsletters and to also support us in the chat boxes as well, and also in the links that you'll see on the screen. So thank you again so much. Thanks to all our panelists for joining, and thanks to you all at home or wherever you may be streaming this live, and we hope you have a good night.
All right, the stream is over. Stopping.